Good morning, everybody. My name's Lloyd Stokes. We are Sourced, and this is Sourced Presents. This is the second episode now that we will be moving over to a podcast. It'll also be on our YouTube channel, our podcast will be on Spotify as of the second week in December, if you're listening to this in the future. Source Presents is a interview series that we created just over a year ago, and the idea was to be able to interview and shine a light on people within our network, predominantly within the kind of go-to-market space, but who've worked in early stage scaling technology companies in different roles, different levels of responsibility, and to understand more about them, their journey, what they've done, what they've seen, and hopefully to focus a little bit on a particular topic that might be challenging for some of the audience listening to. Today, I'm joined by Richard Bray. Richard Bray is currently the COO of a Australian founded construction software company called Project Simple. Rich and I have known each other for 15 years.
Yeah, probably I'd say so, yeah.
Many
years.
Yeah, I should have just said many. There we go. Yeah, it's just showing our age. But 15 years. I originally met Rich at a business called Reach Local, who went on to be a NASDAQ listed, US founded internet marketing software company. Rich was actually my boss, my country director back in, a few years ago, let's say that. Rich has had an unbelievable career so far, plenty of experience in helping organizations to expand and grow, and specifically across a number of different companies, helping them to launch in the UK. And so the main topic that we'll be covering today will be around how do companies expand internationally, how do they launch into the UK market, and hopefully trying to learn as much as we can from Rich's experience of having done that with a few different companies. Rich, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much. Nice to be here.
So I think it's a good place to start as much as we can at the beginning. And we were talking before this, and I remember when I first met you, Rich, it was, as I mentioned, at Reach Local, and your background before that had been working for some massive software companies, SAS and Dell, and then you were working for Reach Local in Australia. Can you tell us a bit more about how that happened?
Yeah, I mean, I've had the pleasure of working all around the world and scaling tech businesses, and as you say, my real grounding and founding in software startup businesses was back in Australia, and so I'm originally a Kiwi. I came over here to the UK, did a gap year, and then ended up going back to Australia to do university studies, and hence why I sound a bit Australian as well. And I found myself really enjoying the culture over there and the tech businesses side of things. Straight out of university, I joined a company called SAS Business Intelligence, which is a large-scale software company run out of US and had a very strong presence down in Australia. I did really well there, was in the strategy and analysis side of the business, so more in the finance and analysis side. Jumped from there to Dell and was heading up pricing for APAC, really, which enabled us to look at the commoditized pricing of a Dell box, peripherals, whatever else, and put it out in the market. And you can start to see the market share you could gain based on the price on the box. So it was really interesting to see from big technology how you could actually have an effect in the market. I got bored there because I got capped pretty quickly based on their certain levels of HR, how much you can get promoted, how much increase you can get in salaries, and I thought, this is just not me. I'm a young buck with grand ideas. I need to be out of here. And so I got the opportunity to join Reach Local in Australia. It was the first international expansion of Reach Local globally outside of the US. It was done by a JV with, at the time, a venture capitalist called Netis, which is now known as Airtree. So Daniel Petrie, incredible guy. He put up a bunch of cash with Reach Local, the founders over there, and Zora Gordon and Michael Klein, and they set up this entity down in Australia. And so I joined to work alongside the CEO, Stephen Power, and to help come up and formulate growth strategies for the business. So using more of an analytical mindset, but working very closely with him to understand where are we seeing gains, losses, how can we squeeze as much out of this business as possible. So they hired a first cohort of sales guys, set about going and expanding the market, and did really well. The first year was very successful, got a lot of sales traction, and really enjoyed it. I started to really thrive in a startup environment where you can get your teeth sunk in and span across the whole business. And at that point, they announced the UK was going to be opening. And so I put my hand up and said, look, I've really enjoyed this whole venture from starting up in this almost incubator style down in Australia. Can I go to the UK and do the same thing? And so I met the appointed CEO for Reach Local UK, John Mazur, who we both know very well, and Patrick Flanagan, and I jumped over and started to help out to grow the business from nothing in the UK. And so taking all that learning from setting up and establishing Australia and working between the venture capitalist and the CEO, taking that and really putting it into practice up here in the UK. So that was actually a really good experience, just from an overall taking what works in one market, did it work in another market? How do you adapt? How do you tailor? How do you localize? And we grew the business from there. So that's I guess how I got into the UK market from a technology perspective. And we had a great run. I mean, Reach Local UK was the fastest growing entity in the world. We did incredibly well, as you know, just to grow our market share, not just in the London and South region, but also up north in Birmingham, Manchester. There were a few challenges with doing so, but we did really well. And obviously the success story is that Reach Local globally IPO'd on the NASDAQ and went up from there. I had the fortune of moving on from Reach Local UK and actually going over to the US mothership as well, post IPO. And I was tasked with trying to turn around some of the performance on the West Coast. And that was really exciting. That was really good fun. Again, another challenge for me to move into another market, the home market, the US, and see what the difference was from how you approach go-to-market especially, but the buying preferences, the way in which you tailor marketing messages, the way in which the product was accepted, changes in the product. A lot of that grounding I've had is almost coming back now, but it was really excited to see the same product offered in so many different markets.
And what did you... Because I remember when working at Reach Local at the time, and in that period, we'd have some of the US guys would come over to the UK, and some of the UK guys would go to the US, and there was always these stories about these amazing kind of US sales Reach Local people who were just and I remember doing some like learning. There was some, I did video calls or something, I can't remember, but we always held up the US salespeople as just this level, just gods, I think. I felt like that anyway. So when you went over there and saw them in action, what did you see that was so different? Or was it not? Was it just a different market?
I think it was just a different market. Yes, for sure. It was a big market and they did very well. And some of those revered salespeople, they were very good at what they did. But don't get me wrong, they were a very different breed. I mean, it's the US in general is a transactional market. And they were bashing out calls and cold calls and emails and knocking doors and trying to get as much business as possible. And you had a hustle, that's for sure. Whereas when you go over to the US market and you look back at the UK market at that time, because we had the status of the fastest growing, best performing office in the world, they were actually revering all the team from the UK. They were wondering why the UK business was so successful. And it's a very different approach. A lot of it's relationships. A lot of it's from past historical contacts that you've had with businesses, and your reputation matters, that's for sure. Whereas in the US, it's a grind, it's a hustle, it's a very transactional marketplace. And so I think it's just a very different approach, and both markets saw very good success, but very, very differently. Interestingly, the market model worked similarly, and that it was an IMC. We used to call it the IMC, the Internet Marketing Consultant. I'd now say is a hybrid AE. It's the BDR with the AE component combined, and you had to go and hunt and kill your own food, which I think is actually interesting to see a lot of businesses now return back to that model. I think the SDR BDR function is expensive and maybe not yielding the right results as a twofer in a box. So that hybrid model worked because you had to qualify, you had to manage the relationship from the start. And I think the same amount of work ethic went in, but it was a very, very different stats game on both sides, both yielding a great result for the top performers.
100%. 100%. When you arrived in the UK, how set up? Because John and Patrick, how much had they already done? How established was it? What was there? What was not there?
Yeah, so look, John and Patrick came from a very different business. They came from AOL. Patrick, I'm not sure, I can't remember exactly what what the business was he directly came out of, but they were from big business America, and so John in particular knew Zora Gordon. John was fortunate too, whilst they're both Americans, John spent a lot of time in the UK and Europe previously, so he knows the market. He's not like, wasn't coming in here fresh and just thinking that the US approach is the way to go. He knew that the UK approach was going to be very different. But they had no real experience of Reach Local, so they were very green in that perspective. And so they were lifting the IP from the US, certainly what we'd done in Australia, and trying to tailor it. But from day one, there was nothing. It was John really going out there and hiring a great bunch of salespeople. So we hired 16 people straight off the bat, trying to localize and tailor everything possible. But there was nothing here. I mean, short of John and Patrick finding an office and starting to hire, we set up everything from scratch. And whilst it was great to have the IP and all the sales material and all the collateral and the expectations and the CRM setup and everything else from the US, there are a lot of nuances and ways in which we had to tailor it to make sure that it was going to meet the market needs over here. And so the reality is that we had to come up with a brand new approach and train it, evolve it, tweak it as we started to test. And fortunately, I think because we hired a really good group. I mean, do you remember the group? You hired the group. You were the one that was bringing in the 16 people. So, some of those people stayed for the longevity of the business over here and did incredibly well from it. So that was probably our most successful cohort of salespeople, which was amazing. There was nothing. It took a lot of tailoring, a lot.
Do you know what's so interesting about that? Just reflecting back on it, is that initial group was so diverse in terms of experience and background and everything, gender, age, diversity, and it wasn't built. I mean, to be honest, there was no talk of diversity. There really wasn't. No, there wasn't.
Not back then.
There wasn't. That's the truth of the matter. But you had people who came from very obvious backgrounds, had worked selling to local markets, local businesses, etc., understood how to sell on internet marketing, Yellow Pages, Thompson Local kind of background, worked incredibly well. Also, there are a lot of people who came from that background who didn't work very well. You had
absolutely
people like John Stanley, who came from a completely random background, but that team was just so unique, and so many of them have gone on to do incredible things.
Yeah, and I think John, who used to say this, is that culture eats strategy for breakfast, and we were fortunate enough to create an incredible culture at that time that we allowed the group to thrive in an environment that, yes, there was a lot of pressure, there was a lot that we're shooting for, but the incentives were well aligned. And the grounding that we had from the international basis that allowed us to approach it in a very different way. So that, I think, created a lot of success. And yeah, for sure. I mean, we from the second and tertiary cohorts that we hired, there were some great stars that shone from there, but we still had a pretty high turnover rate. A turnover rate that's arguably in today's terms, it would be too high. I mean, you certainly would. That reputation about how much turnover we had was very US centric, and it's not very much in the UK kind of model. I think your reputation wouldn't allow for it so much.
No, I agree. I definitely agree. It was of its time for sure. And then moving on, so Reach Local. Talk us through the kind of next career steps, and then up towards, I guess, the next big one would be PredictHQ.
Yeah, so after doing the UK, I moved over and did the US, and really enjoyed the US market. It was interesting because my wife, we just had our first child. My wife didn't want to move. She didn't want to move to America, and so I said, "Look, this is a pretty interesting opportunity. there's, when else are we going to get this paved path to go over to the US and try a new market? And the US, especially as they were putting us up in Orange County, right? So pretty amazing place to land and to experience the culture over there, what we thought so anyway. And so we moved over. Emma, my wife, really didn't enjoy it. She couldn't find her feet there, more so just finding a connection and community, especially with our daughter at the time. And so I said, look, after 6 months, if this is not working out personally for us, then the next move is yours. You choose where you want to go. And so we did the 6 months, and I enjoyed it at Reach Local. Was certainly getting across the rest of the US business and enjoying my time, but she didn't enjoy it. And so 6 months came and went, and we said, right, let's move. Where do you want to go? And she's English, and she chose New Zealand. And so we packed up, we left our stuff in America because we said, look, if this happens again, we don't want to transfer stuff to New Zealand and back over to the UK. And I gave her the choice where she wanted to go. And instead of going to the UK, our home base, she chose New Zealand, which was great for me. My family was back there. It was a nice return. I probably wouldn't have gone back to New Zealand if I had my choice, especially from business perspective. It's a long way from anything, and I knew it was going to be a tough challenge finding and seeing what business was going to be like from a career perspective. But we packed up and shifted. And I landed there and was fortunate enough to jump into a few different businesses, which I started to give some consulting and advisory. First off, I started up a business with one of our good contacts, Joel. It was a digital media agency, the Urban Collective. We tried to do a global approach to offering digital media and marketing. At the time, didn't work as well, but actually what's interesting is if we'd set that up during COVID time, it would have thrived. I think we were just too early to set up the remote working. I actually think that the model could have worked really well if it was probably a couple of years later. Divested from that and then joined a private investment portfolio. It was run by a high net worth individual who had 6 different tech businesses, all operating as a founding business out of New Zealand, but looking to divest and new opportunities coming out of Asia Pacific. And so I was charged with doing more on the M&A side, more on the divestment side, trying to see if we could actually group and consolidate and roll up some of the businesses in Asia Pac. And so that was really good for me because it gave me an external corporate M&A type lens to things, as well as a fundraising perspective, which is what I was missing from the Reach Locals and my previous experience. So getting into those rooms and enjoying the conversations, particularly as you start to look at the exit strategy and pathway for some of these companies, I learned a hell of a lot. Unfortunately, those businesses weren't run as well as they needed to be, and I quickly spied that I needed to move on. And so I fortunately met Campbell Brown, the founder of PredictHQ. It was by chance through a mutual contact, and at that time, Campbell had just raised seed capital. He was about to shift his family over to the US because the US was the market that they needed to be in from growth and clients and funding. And we met on I think it was a Sunday before he flew out, and had breakfast and headed off. And we then met again a couple of times, and I joined and came on as a fractional chief operating officer, which then grew into full-time, and we grew the business. And great Kiwi business, doing incredible things over a longer period of time, raised some great capital from tier 1 Valley Elite VC, and we built an incredible team. The team at PredictHQ to this day is probably the best and smartest and brightest people that I've ever worked with. And we had a lot of fun. Fortunately, through the COVID period, it was a real challenge. I mean, we were selling event data, right? So you think about events and all the impact and the demand causation around events and what that does for commerce. And during COVID, events got turned off. So it was a challenging time operationally and for the business, and for various reasons, after for more so personal reasons, being in New Zealand in around 2024, I decided to move back to the UK with the family, and came with PredictHQ, moved into a chief strategy officer role from the chief operating role, and continued and loved my time there. And then the opportunity to leave PredictHQ and look for something new. I was there for 7 years. But being back in the UK affords you a nice opportunity to start to look outward and start to see some of the other growth opportunities. And a very close friend of mine, Kurt, who runs Project Simple, he founded it with a couple of other guys. been talking, I'd been advising for quite some time on the sidelines, and we decided to join forces. And so I came on again as fractional COO for Project Simple, for Simple, and also to head up the European expansion, which starts with the UK. So that's where I find myself today. So I run an actual advisory, which is an advisory business, but I'm also with Simple, which is my mainstay, and it's where I spend most of my time. And it's exciting to be back in the UK, back with another company over here, trying to help them scale and expand globally, but more so in this market.
Love it. Thank you, Ish. That's a
long story.
It's a really good story, though. I think that there are not lots of people who've had that experience of really big corporate and really big fast growth, like real fast growth. Like Reach Local was, people rocket. I hate the term rocket ship, but it was a rocket ship. It grew super fast. And then to go to much earlier seed funded, to take fractional roles when the term fractional, people didn't even know what fractional was then, but the idea of advisory, etc. There's a 15 years, right? 15, 16 years to bring into you talking on for a few minutes. So, what's interesting is some of the things that you've touched on are things that you were doing earlier that now are considered quite kind of commonplace. But what you did with Joel, that business, I remember talking to you about that at the time, and you had this idea of the fact that what if people who are digital marketing specialists or sales specialists want to work remotely and want to work 3 days a week rather than 5 days a week? Why couldn't they do that? Why wouldn't that be something that they could do? And I remember talking to you at the time back in, I don't know when it was, 2015, 16, maybe 16, 17, something like that.
Yeah, it was
and
around
going,
that,
I'm not sure that'll catch on, Rich. I don't but it was, you're right. And with different timing, with maybe a very different outcome. To then advisory, fractional, the idea that somebody doesn't need to hire somebody full time at a seed funded, Series A funded business to be able to have huge impact and make big difference, and now so common. So I'm interested to understand, within the businesses that you've worked in and seen, what's people's thinking about launching in the UK? Why the UK? Especially now, like why the UK now, and what's the thought process that you commonly see?
Look, I think it's a natural progression for a lot of English-speaking countries, businesses and countries, where they're looking for a larger market that they can to expand and grow more market share. So, certainly from the Antipodean founders, the Saffers, the Kiwis, the Aussies, it's a very attractive market. I think in some ways more attractive than the US, because the US is just this behemoth. It's not one market, it's 50 markets. And quite frankly, you have to move to the US to be able to be taken seriously. Whereas the UK is a bit of a different market. There's a very different approach you can play over here, but it's very, very attractive. Likewise, for American businesses, it's the stepping stone to get into the rest of Europe. It's the way in which you can start to look at opening up from a total European base, but it's a natural progression. Market size, market potential is definitely the leading cause or reason for it. I think that the allure of the UK market sometimes overtakes, and some founders probably underestimate decisions and the areas where they could fail. They think it's just a natural extension of their business, and it really is not. It's interesting. I mean, if you look at it, 60% of foreign businesses who come to the UK fail within 5 years, which is pretty alarming, right? 60%. And there's a whole bunch of reasons why they fail, but the majority of it is because they've underestimated the poor setup and how you need to approach this market. And I guess what I see there is there's probably 5 different areas that people need to focus on. One is how you set it up. Absolutely. So there's all the baseline, you got to think through the initial entity. Is it a subsidiary? Is it a standalone? How are you going to consolidate under local country taxation, or are you going to bring the revenue back home to your home country? How do you consider things like transfer pricing agreements, the associated IP licenses? I mean, there's a whole bunch around the setup, right? You can get that very wrong. And there are a lot of businesses, particularly when they look at compliance and regulation or taxation, they get it very wrong. So it ends up costing them a lot more to be operating in this market than they think. Getting those key decisions right at the beginning actually extends out probably years after that as to whether you're going to be successful. So that's kind of area one. The second area I think is people. There's this who you hire to run the entity or to run the operation. That is a big area for failure. And I think, again, they think of it like an extension of their own business rather than looking at it as a very different market and who and how you need to hire in that market. Not just one person, but the team, the approach, the skill set, the personality, even down to the local dialect. I mean, I think people think of this as one homogenous market. It's not. It's multiple different markets. And as you know, the accents and the tonality of people in this market, they greatly differs. What you sell and how you sell up in Manchester or Birmingham is very different to how you sell down here in the South. So that's the second area. The third is how you approach it. So that is the way in which you're going to be, looking at go-to-market and marketing. I think people have got this approach where they think it's, again, an extension of the way in which they do it. It's not. You have to be very, very tailored. And there's a whole bunch of stuff we can unpack there if you want to. But that approach and how you go to market is incredibly overestimated.
On that point,
underestimated.
On that point, Mitch, I see that a lot. So businesses that I've recruited from Australia and America, actually, I'm like, what's the approach? And they'll go, well, this is what we do here. I'm like, okay, but I mean, a great example, I spoke to a candidate the other day who's joined an Australian software business, been there for a year, is looking to leave, senior director. And one of the things that they just have not acknowledged is that in Australia, their company has about 10 competitors, whereas in the UK, they have about 400. So he's like, clearly the approach needs to be different.
Yep, absolutely. And it's not just the breadth and depth of your offering and how you compete on a like-for-like basis. It's other things that matter here as well. It's your reputation. It's your onboarding experience. It's the way in which you set up for managing that customer after the sale. That really counts. I mean, as I mentioned before, the US, it's a very transactional market. In some ways, some of the other markets, the English-speaking markets, are quite transactional. Not all of them, but yeah, over here, relationships matter in a big, big way. So how you approach it has to be different. And I think a lot of people think they can just lift and place potentially an executive from that overseas and just make it work. That's not going to work. The second is they think they can hire an experienced person in market, and a lot of time there's actually quite a bit of friction because that local person isn't given the grounds to tailor things as much as they need. They're given a box and said, you can make decisions, but in this box, you can't affect everything else. So if there's challenges around how we market overall the business, or if the product's not 100% fit from a product fit perspective because of the way in which the data is stored, or you approach things from a terminology perspective, or how things like workflows are set up, then it's going to impact your ability to sell and compete in this market. So every single decision you make counts. And when you sum it all together and you get the aggregate of all these decisions, that's going to be the ultimate of how successful you're going to be here. But certainly, I think underestimating how much tailoring and localization is needed, probably one of the biggest failure points.
I completely agree. I think I've seen examples where marketing collateral has got Australian terms, dollars instead of pounds, and I've had people who've gone, this is as simple as to take something so simple that could be changed in 5 minutes, and this is what we've got to work with at the moment. It's just a lack of preparation. I also think often a lack of investment. So the idea that you can just hire a senior level person who may have worked in a competitor, much bigger business, let's say, for example, would be a common mistake I see. So we're in this world, in this sector, we're going to go and find one of the senior people in our competitor in the UK who's probably worked there for a long time, is probably quite used to and is very good, but also very used to working in a big corporate environment. And then suddenly when you're the first person with no financial support around you, no people around you, and are told to go out there and start getting in front of customers, I mean, of course, I'm making it sound really simple, but I've seen that. I've seen it be done that simply.
Absolutely. And yeah, I think ultimately, as we've previously discussed, is that if you're going to take a market like this seriously, then absolutely there needs to be a certain budget put aside to be able to set this up for success. And you can't just hire one person and say that you're in the market. You have to look at the approach. For sure, you might want to hire one person and start to test the market in different ways, but that's not necessarily a VP or a senior leader or a C-level executive. It could actually be someone mid-level. It could actually be someone who's more of a founding AE, which we've talked about previously. But they've got to be given the foundations of being successful. They've got the infrastructure from back home. There's enough for them to make localized decisions. So there's a real balance as to what level you hire first and foremost, how much grounds for tailoring they have. And that's where I think, I think the role of the fractional leader comes in, because sometimes some of these businesses don't want to put that much budget towards that. But if you had a fractional leader that could come in and help to set up the scene, certainly set up the infrastructure and set the business up for success, but then have a portion of that budget that's not being used on that full-time leader going towards maybe a salesperson or a BDR or whatever it's going to be, drum up business, it's a far better approach. And so you can spread the investment. There are many different ways you can do it, but I think for businesses just to launch over here and not seek the advice and seek the counsel of people that have been proven to see success in this market, or you're hitting and hoping. You don't know what's going to land here.
Yeah, I agree. I'm thinking then that if you take the most recent example, working with Kurt at Simple, you obviously have a very unique relationship. You guys are great friends, known each other for a long time. So that creates a lot. It solves a lot of issues. It creates issues, I'm sure, as well. But when you're speaking to Kurt and he's saying, I want to launch in the UK, what are the questions that you're posing to him to understand the decision making, what the kind of like challenges that you're saying? Have you considered this? Have you considered this? And then if you take that forward and look at like what you're doing right now for Simple in the UK, maybe you could just give a bit more detail around your role and the responsibilities that you have.
Yeah, the great thing about Kurt and Simple is that they were very thoughtful about the approach. So my first questions are, why the UK? What's here? What's the reasoning? What's the intention? What's the expectation? And setting the scene as to why they would approach this market overall against another market, just to kind of get an understanding of, well, what do they see in this? Is it just an extension, or is it actually a real thoughtful expansion strategy here? They'd done a lot of that work, which was around the comparisons between the different markets, the similarities, the types of businesses crossover. The ICP, is the ICP going to be largely the same? Are they facing the same problems up here as down there? What they discovered is that actually there's probably even more of an opportunity in this market because of regulation and because of compliance issues in the construction industry that was going to enable them to be more successful if they had a right go-to-market approach. And so a lot of what Kurt and I discussed already built a lot of the infrastructure around the product itself and being able to localize it and setting it up so it had data sovereignty in this market. But there were a lot of tweaks that needed to be made. So we went through systematically to make sure that everything was localized. And right from the start, Kurt had apportioned and said, we are going to apportion budget to be able to set up correctly. We had to look at the right role. And obviously we hired a great recruiter and source to help us find a great salesperson to start here. But that profile changed as we went through, right? I mean, the profile from when we engaged you to what we actually ended up with changed considerably as we started to look at the market. And so the whole time we were trying to evaluate what's going to be best, not being constrained by budget decisions or what our thought process was in Australia. It's how are we going to see the best result in a short time frame and test this market to be able to see the success that we think it's got. And so fortunately, I think we were very, very aligned in how we would approach it, the budgeting, the infrastructure that was needed, the marketing setup that was needed, and it actually just came down to an execution of a plan, which was great. Where I've seen friction in previous businesses, and probably more so if people don't have a baseline relationship, is that you have a mismatch in that the there should be a global brand, and there should be a global way in which we position, and there should be a global way in which we should be able to do a cookie cutter salesperson. If that localized approach is not being tested and able to be give them the empowerment to be able to make those changes, it's going to fall over. And the friction between it and not enabling that person to have that final say, that's where I see a lot of challenges coming up and where the mismatch is.
Interesting. Yeah, I think that so many of the challenges that we see are who to hire and when to hire. What you bring that I think is quite unique is a operational, strategic and commercial background, which is, let's be honest, it's bloody hard to find. But what are there are obvious benefits, but what do you see are the major benefits to maybe appointing somebody with your kind of background for a business as that first person, rather than just saying, I'm going to find a founding AE or a VP of sales?
So one of the big things that's overlooked is hierarchy. So what is the organizational structure? So who is that AE going to report to? Are they going to report to a sales manager back in the home country? Are they going to report to an executive in the home country? Are you planning to put someone over the top of them in this country? Who's going to mentor them? Who's going to manage them? Who's going to give them guidance on how to make those decisions on which customers to put into the ICP and how they're going to be, going and selling? What about considerations on time zone? All those considerations matter. And even from a customer success point of view, are they going to be serviced? Once you've sold a customer, what's the handover process look like? Is that customer going to be handed over to a customer success person initially in a different market? Are you going to hire straight away in this market when you haven't proven it? Is there a hybrid approach to doing so? Every single decision makes a massive difference. And I think that's where, a lot of people do get it wrong. I mean, if you're going to hire a founding AE, great. Let's get a great salesperson, potentially from a competitor organization or who's just got ability to go and turn on sales. Let's call them a rainmaker. Great, put them in place. If you put them in place and then all of a sudden you're putting them into an Australian or an American sales manager who is treating them and trying to force them into the ways in which the American market or the Australian market is going to go, that's going to be really challenging. So think through every single mechanism of that. So what does the CRM look like? How are you managing them in forecast calls? What does a sales cycle look like in this country versus another country? What are those metrics and how are you going to measure them and manage them compared to what's going on in that other country? And how do they get guidance on conversion rates? So let's get really gritty here. What you're going to see if you're looking at a stage 1 opportunity in the sales cycle or a stage 3 opportunity and you're seeing a fall off rate in the conversion rates between those two stages, let's say from initial contact right through to commercial scoping, then beyond to stage 5 to a formal proposal, those conversion rates are going to differ in this market to other countries. So how is that US manager going to give guidance on what the best strategy is in this market? How is an executive going to weigh in and say, this is the way I think your tonality and how you should approach the relationship when you're starting to send a formal proposal? So all of those little decisions really do aggregate over time. Now, vice versa, if you put an executive into the business, is the executive really going to get on the phones and start calling and make sure they get across from a cold calling basis or just in general outreach and start to learn the nuances to how to message this? Is it more relaxed tone? Is it more forthright tone? Is it a direct tone? Is it an organic conversation? At Simple, we've just taken a very different approach, and I'll let you into this one, which we're testing at the moment. We've actually gone back to handwritten letters as prospecting.
Right. Okay.
And the reason for it is because emails don't work. They're done. Like people get so many emails, they don't work. Calling still works, but if they've got no context, given the relationship basis over here, people like a more personalized approach. And so handwriting letters to executives, delivering it to their office, testing this at the moment, but I've got great hope for this. So I think it's something we could actually teach back to other markets. But if you're an executive, when was the last time you got a handwritten letter? And if someone followed up on the call and said, hey, I just sent you a letter, we're new to this market, I just wanted to make sure, one, you've received the letter, and two, I'd love the opportunity just to have a conversation with you. Not dialing straight into a sales conversation. It's a very different approach. And I think that's the point, is that Executive might not get that if you're not on the coalface and understanding it. So there's a real balance between all elements of seniority to hierarchy to organizational structure that has to convert into this perfect scenario of where you're learning and how you're going to adapt.
Letter writing. I love that though. No, we've tried gifting, for example. That's had some success, like sending a personalized gift. It definitely helps. I think those small personal touches, regardless of what they are, often if they are physical in some way, go a long way. And I can make it like super simple. Just meeting somebody for a drink or a coffee. People are like, oh yeah, wow, I'd love to do that, as if it's like never been done before.
Yeah, and that comes back to the relationship base over here as well. And I think the good thing about a market this size, especially when you get these condensed population pockets like you do in not just London, but in Birmingham and Manchester and other markets around where, let's be honest, there's a lot of great tech businesses up in Manchester. There's a lot of business up in the north in general, if you look at Liverpool and Manchester and everywhere. And what that brings is there are so many different specific communities you can go and tap into from a network perspective. So that's where face-to-face meetings, business influencers, partners over here. Partners are absolutely key for success. You've got to know how to approach it. Looking at Chamber of Commerce meetings to any connections you can put. I definitely think this market is ripe for referral schemes. I think the more that people lean into getting a first few wins on the board, but having some sort of referral basis, because trust is a big factor. It's not as transactional. You have to be able to trust. And that's why that post-sale success metric is so key. If you're not setting them up with localized support, with someone who's going to be at the end of a phone to be able to support them, whatever the size of the actual sales value is, you're going to be challenged. They don't want Australian hours. They don't want American hours. They don't want to call up and be put through to some sort of call center. And I know we're kind of going through some things that may seem pretty common sense. You'd be surprised at how many people from the first touch, and let's say the first 12 months in this country, try and make less decisions or try and leverage their home base more so. Agree. Impacts the customer profile.
Completely agree. And fundamentally, I think that when it comes down to it, if I'm honest, most of it just comes down to investment and lack of commitment to actually really go for it.
Absolutely.
I'm simplifying that, but that's what I believe, is what I see. I've worked on roles where they've hired one person, said that they're going to build an infrastructure around that person, and then a year later, still no infrastructure. And the angle is, well, they're not selling, they're not bringing in the revenue. I'm like, well, it's chicken and the egg, but you've said you're going to do something, and fundamentally, I don't think you ever really were going to. You just hoped that you could bring in somebody, that they would start selling the product, and that would be your.
I completely agree with you. I think the analogy is really about the wood chopper, and you can hire a bloody slugger and get him to swing at the tree. Go for it. Keep on going. If he's got a blunt axe and you're not supporting him, then spend the time, sharpen the axe, make sure he's hitting in the right place, make sure he's hitting the right tree as well. But a lot of that should come down to before you even enter the market. And if you've not got the right advice, or even got a launch plan, or got someone to give you guidance on the best approach for that specific business to expand and what it's going to cost, don't enter the market.
Agreed. Is there any other support and resource that we've not discussed already that you think that a business that's launching in the UK needs that they often overlook?
I think there are some government bodies that actually offer some support. It was interesting. I was talking to the New Zealand Trade Commissioner for Paris the other day. There are some really interesting support mechanisms coming out for via governments for trade and enterprise. Trade do something similar as well. I think they are a good avenue. I think there's a mismatch between public and private support, which is, I think there's an opportunity there to be able to really articulate what's going on the ground. It's not just from a funding perspective. It's not just about using the doing some of these trade delegations to come over and talk to other founders. There's a real, where the rubber hits the road, the expectation on the execution. That's probably what's missing a little bit. But I think the governments are trying because they realize the value of it. That's one. I think there's a lot of great advisory and potentially fractional leaders that can weigh in. I think that's what we've talked about many times, is that there is a lot of support, but it's probably not directed in the right direction to be able to guide some of these companies. I think it may be mismatched. I think people, say for example, sales resources, right? There are a lot of people focused and helping to scale businesses, but there's an element before that you can't scale in this country unless you've got the foundations of a good plan to start with. And so there's some pre-help that's needed. I think that's a big element. Mouse, I think marketing teams, it's an interesting one. So marketing teams, we spent a lot of time about how to approach it from a sales perspective and messaging from a messaging point of view. But I think they're another one where budgets from an international perspective sometimes just get drip fed in. There's only a small portion. And I think it needs to have an overall marketing approach. And unless that marketing team understand how to attach to certain points that are going on in the market, whether it's regulation they want to attach to or relevant user industry events, if they don't know the market, it's going to be very hard. So I think there's marketing guidance and advisory as well that's needed. I think those are probably the main areas I see. I think, apart from the standard accountancy, taxation, that type of stuff, it's good.
There's a lot. There's a lot to consider. A lot more than most people would consider, I think, as we've just discussed. Rich, I'm conscious we're going to wrap up shortly. I'm going to ask you one final question before we finish. And it's, why do you love what you do?
Good question. I think, look, I've been fortune of working in some incredible businesses in some incredible locations around the world. I really take pleasure in seeing where strategy and execution meet. And if great idea, which is thought of by any person in any business, gets executed well, can result in something meaningful, that's exciting. And that's where I love startup, scale-up businesses, is because the ideas come from anywhere and it can have such a tangible effect on the result of a company. And seeing the small twists and turns and the roller coaster ride that is a scale-up business, I do love it. It's an adrenaline rush. It's certainly, don't get me wrong, there's many challenges that come with it, particularly working with oversized businesses and time zones. But I think really I get a real rush from seeing people thrive in a business and seeing younger or new people coming into this environment, seeing them rise through the ranks very quickly, which you're not going to see in large corporates. And that's ultimately what I love to see.
Love it. Well, Rich, I've worked for you. I've worked with you. As we said at the beginning, we've known each other for a long time, and I think just such an interesting and quite unique background. I think you, like I said, there aren't many people who have that range and breadth of experience, having done it for different companies, different sectors, started your own thing. There's a lot to uncover in a 45-minute podcast, but I think we've covered a lot there. I think there's a huge amount to consider when making the investment and a decision to launch in a new region, and definitely in the UK. And I think that we've covered a lot of it. So thank you, mate. I really appreciate you giving your time. You're so generous with that. And for anybody who listens to this and is interested in maybe challenges that they've got, then I'd definitely encourage to reach out to Rich on LinkedIn. It would be well worth your time to utilise his experience. So thanks, mate.
Thank you very much. I certainly appreciate you, mate. I am very grateful for our friendship as well as our professional relationship as well. I'm very fortunate to work with you and to also be friends, and it's a nice combination.
100%. Thank you, mate.
Great. Thank you.